Every night, someone presses play, looking for a little peace. Maybe tonight, that's you. Welcome to Sleepy Shadows, your quiet place to slow down, relax, and drift into the unknown. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, what time it is there, and are you already in bed or just getting comfortable? Now, make yourself comfortable and let's drift into the darkness. Before COVID-19, I worked as a guide on a ghost tour in St. Augustine, Florida. During my time there, I collected more strange stories than I could ever count. When you spend enough nights working in some of the oldest buildings in the country, you eventually stop expecting every experience to have a simple explanation. People always ask me which story is my favorite. There are plenty I could tell, but this is the one I always come back to. At the time, our tours were conducted on a trolley, and before the pandemic, we were allowed to bring guests inside 2 different historic buildings. One stop was Potter's Wax Museum, which also included the oldest drugstore, and the other was the old St. John's County Jail. This experience happened inside the Wax Museum. On that particular night, I was playing the role of the executioner. Part of my job involved telling visitors the story of Andrew Ranson, the pirate who was famously said to have survived his execution. It was a fun role to play, and after repeating the story night after night, I had the routine down perfectly. Before each tour arrived, I had to prepare the museum. That meant checking the route, making sure everything was ready for the guests, and setting the atmosphere. Part of that setup involved placing small electronic candles throughout the museum. They weren't real candles, of course, but they created just enough soft light to give the rooms an eerie atmosphere without making it difficult for visitors to see where they were walking. We only placed them in areas the tour groups would actually pass through. Anything hidden from the tour route usually stayed dark. Once I finished setting everything up, I realized I had a little extra time before the first trolley arrived. Whenever that happened, I liked wandering through the museum by myself. After spending so many nights there, I knew every hallway, every room, and every wax figure almost by memory. Walking through the building alone after closing was strangely peaceful. The museum was completely silent. Without visitors, you could hear every little creak the old building made. The stillness gave the wax figures an entirely different presence than they had during the day. Even though I worked there regularly, wandering through the exhibits alone at night always felt a little surreal. There was one section of the museum that was almost always darker than the rest. It wasn't because anything was wrong with the lighting. It simply wasn't visible from the hallway used during the tour, so we didn't bother placing any of the electronic candles there. Since guests never really saw that part of the museum, it remained mostly in shadow. The area was known as the Hall of Presidents. I'd walked through it countless times before. That night was no different, or at least it didn't seem different at first. I started down the hallway as I always did. At the far end stood the wax figure of Sam Houston. If you've never seen it, it's an impressive figure. Sam Houston was a large man in real life, standing about 6 feet 6 inches tall, and the wax figure reflected that imposing height. From the far end of the hall, it always stood out. As I walked toward it, something caught my attention. The figure looked darker. At first, I didn't think much of it. Museums like that play tricks on your eyes all the time. The lighting changes from room to room. Shadows shift depending on where you're standing. I assumed it was just another one of those little optical illusions that happen in dimly lit places. So I kept walking. Looking back, I probably should have trusted that uneasy feeling. Instead, I brushed it aside. Then, everything changed. Without warning, the figure moved. I watched what I believed was the wax figure of Sam Houston slowly turn toward me. For a split second, my brain simply refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Wax figures don't move. I knew that. I'd walked past this one hundreds of times. Yet there it was, facing me. Before I even had time to process what was happening, it suddenly charged. It came straight at me. Fast, there wasn't any hesitation. No slow movement. One moment it was standing at the end of the hallway. The next, it was rushing directly toward me. Instinct completely took over. I jumped backward as quickly as I could. At the same time, I unleashed what was probably one of the longest strings of profanity of my entire life. Every other word out of my mouth was an F-bomb. Most of them were directed at whatever had just come charging toward me. I wasn't trying to sound brave. I wasn't trying to confront anything. I was reacting purely out of shock. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. Not gradually, not by stepping into another room. It simply disappeared right in front of me. One instant it was charging. The next, there was nothing. I stood there breathing hard, still halfway through yelling every curse word I could think of. As I slowly collected myself, I looked toward the end of the hallway again. There stood the wax figure, exactly where it had always been, perfectly still, exactly where it was supposed to be. It hadn't moved. It looked completely ordinary. If someone had walked into the hallway at that exact moment, they would have seen nothing unusual at all. Just me standing there, out of breath, staring at a wax figure while muttering a few final choice words under my breath. I kept looking between the statue and the empty space in front of me. Nothing else happened. The hallway returned to complete silence. I eventually finished calming down enough to continue working, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. I've replayed the experience countless times. I know what I saw. I also know how impossible it sounds. The thing that charged me wasn't simply a shadow in the shape of a person. It looked exactly like Sam Houston's figure, until the moment it moved. Only after it disappeared did I realize the actual wax figure had remained standing where it belonged the entire time. Whatever rushed toward me had only been wearing that appearance. To give you an idea of just how imposing it looked, remember that Sam Houston stood around 6 feet 6 inches tall during his lifetime. Whatever came running at me matched that size. Seeing something that large sprint directly toward you from the darkness is enough to make anyone react. Over time, I tried to figure out exactly what had happened. The museum already had a reputation among the staff. People working there often talked about unexplained experiences. There were 2 spirits that employees frequently mentioned. One was said to be a man dressed in a top hat and Victorian clothing from the 19th century. The other was believed to be a woman wearing a white nightgown. According to the stories shared among the staff, both were known to interact with the living from time to time. The woman generally had a quieter reputation. The man, not so much. If you listened to enough employees, you'd hear the same description over and over again. The man in the top hat had a habit of harassing people. He enjoyed startling staff members and making his presence known. Compared to the woman, he had a reputation for being much more aggressive. I could never prove which one, if either, had anything to do with what happened that night. No one could. But if I had to guess, my money has always been on the man in the top hat. The experience certainly fit the stories I'd heard about him. Whether that's actually what happened, I honestly can't say. Working in a place like that teaches you something interesting. Most nights are completely normal. Guests come through, you tell the stories, answer questions, and head home. Then every once in a while, something happens that doesn't fit neatly into any explanation you can come up with. I've considered every ordinary possibility. Maybe the darkness distorted my perception. Maybe my eyes played an elaborate trick on me. Maybe exhaustion caused my brain to misinterpret shadows in a museum full of lifelike figures. Those explanations are certainly possible, but none of them fully explain the overwhelming certainty I felt as something that looked exactly like Sam Houston turned, rushed directly at me, and disappeared before reaching me. I've worked in haunted locations. I've heard countless ghost stories. Most of them don't genuinely unsettle me anymore. This one still does, because no matter how many times I replay it in my mind, I always come back to the same image. A 6'6" figure standing motionless at the end of a dark hallway, turning to face me, charging without warning, then vanishing into thin air, leaving the real wax figure standing exactly where it had been all along. Out of all the strange things I experienced while working those ghost tours in St. Augustine, that night inside the Wax Museum remains the one I have never been able to explain. I grew up hearing it every now and then, and even though I've always been able to think of a perfectly reasonable explanation for what happened, it still frightened me as a kid. The image of it stayed with me for years. The story goes back to when my mom was a young teenager. She still lived at home, in the bedroom she'd had for years. Like many bedrooms, it looked completely ordinary during the day. At night, though, it changed. There was a window positioned so that whenever the moon was bright enough, the light would shine directly across the room and onto her closet door. The moonlight didn't spread evenly across the wall. Instead, it formed a soft oval shape on the closet door. Night after night, the same pale oval appeared. It was just moonlight. Nothing unusual about that. Still, my mom always remembered noticing it before going to sleep. One night, she had an incredibly vivid dream. In the dream, the oval of moonlight wasn't simply a patch of light anymore. It had become something else. It looked like a doorway, or perhaps a portal. As she watched, several small creatures climbed out of it. She always described them as looking like goblins, not the friendly sort you see in children's stories. These were unsettling little figures with strange faces and movements that didn't seem quite human. One by one, they stepped through the glowing oval as though they were entering the room from somewhere beyond the closet door. Instead of attacking her, they surrounded her bed. They stood around her, laughing, taunting her, and making her feel trapped. She couldn't understand what they wanted. She only knew they were there. One of them wandered away from the others. It climbed into the wooden rocking chair beside her bed. Then, it simply sat there, slowly, back and forth, back and forth. The chair rocked gently while the others continued surrounding her. The entire dream felt frighteningly real. Everything about it seemed vivid. The moonlight, the creatures, the room, the quiet creaking of the rocking chair. Eventually, she woke up. For a brief moment, she lay perfectly still, trying to separate the dream from reality. The room was dark except for the familiar oval of moonlight on the closet door. Everything looked normal. Then she noticed the rocking chair. It was still moving, very gently, back and forth, back and forth. The motion was already slowing, but it hadn't stopped. She simply watched it for a few moments. Then, little by little, the chair became still. That was the end of it. Nothing else unusual happened. She never claimed she saw the creatures after waking. She never said the glowing oval became a portal again. It was just that one dream. And one gently rocking chair. Whenever she told the story, she'd usually admit there was probably a perfectly ordinary explanation. During the night, she could easily have bumped the chair in her sleep. If she'd moved around while dreaming, she might have nudged it without realizing it. By the time she woke up from the nightmare, it could still have been rocking from that movement. That explanation makes complete sense. In fact, it's probably the most likely one. Even so, when you're a child, listening to a story like that, logic doesn't always win. What stayed with me wasn't the explanation. It was the picture my mind created. The moonlight forming a perfect oval on a closet door. Tiny goblin-like figures quietly stepping through it. One sitting silently in the rocking chair beside the bed. And then the unsettling image of my mom opening her eyes to find that same chair still gently moving in the darkness. Whether it was nothing more than an unusually vivid nightmare that happened to end with a chair still rocking, or something stranger that she'll never be able to explain, I honestly don't know. All I know is that when I was younger, every time moonlight shone through my bedroom window, I found myself looking at my closet door just a little longer than usual. And I always made sure there wasn't a rocking chair anywhere near my bed. I used to work at a small food place inside a shopping mall. Like most mall jobs, the work was pretty routine. The days were usually busy, especially on weekends, and the evenings were spent cleaning up, closing the register, and getting everything ready for the next morning. After working there for a while, you get used to the building itself. You learn the sounds it makes. The air conditioning hummed constantly. Metal gates rattled when stores opened or closed. Carts rolled through the corridors late at night. The building always seemed to have some kind of background noise. So when strange sounds started happening, none of us thought much about them. Every so often we'd hear loud banging somewhere behind the walls. Other times there would be a long, sharp screeching sound that echoed through the mall. It wasn't something that happened every day, but it happened often enough that everyone working there had noticed it. The explanation always seemed simple. Old building, old pipes, heating systems, air ducts. There were plenty of reasonable possibilities. Whenever someone asked about the noises, another employee would usually shrug and blame the plumbing or the building settling. That answer made enough sense for everyone to move on. The sounds eventually became just another part of working there. There was something else that happened from time to time. Our computer screens would occasionally glitch. Without warning, the displays would briefly flash bright red. At the same time, the clock on the system would suddenly change. Instead of showing the correct time, it would read 1:10 a.m. It didn't matter whether it was the middle of the afternoon or early evening. Whenever the glitch happened, the timestamp always changed to exactly the same time, 1:10 a.m. Then, just as suddenly, everything would return to normal. The correct time would reappear. The red screen would disappear. The computers would continue working as though nothing had happened. Again, we assumed it was some kind of technical issue. Computers fail, registers freeze, software glitches. None of us knew enough about the system to question it very much. After seeing it happen a few times, we simply accepted it as another strange quirk of the place. The banging, the screeching, the red computer screens, the incorrect timestamp. Individually, none of it seemed especially mysterious. There was probably a logical explanation for all of it. At least, that's what we believed. Then, one night, everything happened at once. It was an unusually busy evening. The mall was packed. Looking out through the front of our store, you could see people everywhere. Families walked past carrying shopping bags. Groups of teenagers wandered from one store to another. Children ran ahead of their parents. The food court was full of people finishing dinner before heading home. Business had been steady all night. Eventually, closing time arrived. We had already locked up and were finishing the usual cleanup. My coworker and I were taking care of the last few tasks before leaving. Although our store was closed, there were still plenty of people outside. The mall hadn't emptied yet. From where we stood, we could still see customers walking past the front of the store. Everything felt completely normal. Then, we heard it. The screeching. At first, I barely reacted. We'd heard it before. But almost immediately, I realized something was different. This time, it was much louder. Far louder than I had ever heard it. Instead of sounding distant, it echoed through the building with enough force to make me stop what I was doing. It didn't resemble the ordinary creaking of an old building anymore. It was long, sharp, almost metallic. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. My coworker looked up too. Neither of us said anything. We simply listened. Then the computers changed. Without warning, every screen turned completely red. Not a quick flash like we'd seen before. Solid red. Every monitor froze. The usual information disappeared. Only the timestamp remained. 1:10 a.m. Exactly the same time we'd seen during every previous glitch. Only this time it didn't disappear after a second or two. The screens stayed that way. The bright red glow filled the counter area. Neither of us touched the keyboards. We just stared. The screeching continued. Louder, longer, the sound seemed impossible to locate. It didn't feel like it was coming from one direction. It surrounded us. Instinctively, I looked toward the front window of the store. I expected to see the same crowd that had been there only moments earlier. Instead, the mall was empty. Completely empty. I still remember how unnatural it looked. The wide corridors stretched out in front of us without a single person walking through them. Every business was closed. Metal security gates covered storefront after storefront. The lights inside the surrounding shops were off. The entire mall looked abandoned. Not gradually empty the way malls usually become late at night. Instantly empty. As though hours had passed in the space of a few seconds. The contrast was so sudden that my mind couldn't make sense of it. Only moments earlier, the corridors had been full of people. Now there wasn't a single customer anywhere. No security guards, no cleaners, nobody. The silence outside somehow made the screeching inside feel even louder. I turned toward my coworker. I didn't have to ask whether they had seen it. The expression on their face told me everything. They looked just as shocked as I felt. Neither of us understood what we were looking at. For a few long seconds, nobody spoke. We simply stood there, staring first at the red computer screens, then back out into the completely deserted mall. The timestamp never changed. 1:10 a.m. The screeching continued. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Not gradually, not fading away. It ended instantly. 1 second, the sound filled the building. The next, there was absolute silence. At the exact same moment, the computer screens returned to normal. The red disappeared. The correct displays came back. The clocks returned to the actual time. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Almost without thinking, both of us looked back through the front window. The mall was crowded again. People walked past carrying shopping bags. Families moved through the corridors. The surrounding businesses were open. The lights were on. It was exactly the same busy evening we'd been looking at only moments earlier. Nothing appeared unusual. There was no sign that anything had changed. If someone had walked by our store right then, they would have seen a perfectly ordinary shopping mall. I looked back at my coworker. They were still staring toward the window. Neither of us needed to ask what the other had seen. We'd both been there. We'd both watched the mall become completely empty. We'd both seen the red computer screens displaying the same impossible time. We'd both heard that unbearable screeching echo through the building. And we'd both watched everything return to normal as though none of it had ever happened. We didn't spend much time trying to investigate. Neither of us went looking through the mall. Neither of us stayed around, wondering if it might happen again. We finished what little we absolutely had to do, and got out of there as quickly as possible. I've replayed that night in my mind more times than I can count. The strange noises before that evening always seemed easy to explain. Old pipes, mechanical systems. The computer glitches could have been faulty hardware or software. Even the timestamp might have been some strange programming bug. Each piece on its own had a reasonable explanation. What I can't explain is why all of it happened together. Why the screeching suddenly became louder than ever before. Why every screen stayed solid red instead of flashing. Why every clock displayed exactly 1:10 a.m. And most of all, why both my coworker and I looked out the window and saw an empty, dark shopping mall where a crowded evening had existed only moments earlier. Maybe there is a perfectly ordinary explanation that neither of us recognized in the moment. I'd like to believe there is. But even after all these years, I still remember looking through that front window and seeing a mall that appeared to have been abandoned for hours. Then, in the space of a heartbeat, it was full of life again. I've worked in plenty of places since then. Some have been older. Some have made strange noises. Some have had malfunctioning equipment. None of them have ever made me leave as quickly as I left that mall. To this day, whenever I happen to notice the time 1:10 on a clock, I immediately think of those solid red computer screens, the deafening screech that echoed through the building, and the impossible moment when an entire crowded shopping mall simply disappeared. Whether what we experienced was a bizarre coincidence, a shared misunderstanding, or something neither of us could explain, I honestly don't know. I only know that neither of us stayed long enough to find out if it would happen a second time. I was at home in Pakistan one day while my mum and my sisters had gone out shopping. It was an ordinary day, and nothing about it suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. I had just finished praying. After I was done, I left the room and started walking through the house. That's when something happened that I've never been able to explain. Out of nowhere, I heard the sound of gunshots. They weren't loud enough to sound as if they were happening outside the house. Instead, they seemed strangely close, almost as though the sound had happened right beside my ear. The shots were faint, but unmistakable. I stopped walking immediately. For a moment, I just stood there trying to understand what I'd heard. The house was quiet. No one else reacted. No one came running to ask what the noise had been. It quickly became obvious that I was the only person who had heard anything. That was what unsettled me the most. If real gunfire had been that close, surely everyone in the house would have heard it. But they hadn't. Almost instantly, my thoughts went to my mum and my sisters. They were still out shopping. I don't know why my mind connected those sounds to them so quickly, but it did. The feeling came without any logical reason. I suddenly had the urge to call them. I even thought about reaching for my phone. Then another thought crossed my mind. If they really were in some kind of danger, I wasn't sure what a phone call would actually accomplish. If something serious was happening, there probably wouldn't be much I could do from where I was. So I didn't call. Instead, I waited. It felt like a very long wait. I kept thinking about them, hoping they would walk through the front door soon. I tried to distract myself, but my thoughts kept returning to those strange gunshots I'd heard after finishing my prayer. The feeling stayed with me until they finally came home. When they walked inside, the first thing I noticed was the look on their faces. They weren't talking much. They looked shaken. There was a heaviness about them that immediately stood out. At first, though, I didn't pay much attention to it. The only thing I cared about was that they had made it home safely. Whatever had happened, they were alive. That alone was enough to make me feel relieved. I greeted my mum as I normally would. She sat down without saying very much. For a while, the house was quiet. She seemed to be gathering herself before she was ready to talk about what had happened. About an hour later, she finally told us the story. They had been driving home after shopping. Their driver had stopped the car at a red traffic light. It was a road with 3 lanes. Their car was waiting in the middle lane. Everything seemed completely normal. Then, without warning, the door of a car in the lane to their left opened. A man got out carrying an AK-style rifle. Instead of approaching their vehicle, he walked directly past it. He continued toward the car stopped in the lane on the right. My mum said he walked right past their window. Then he reached the other vehicle. Without hesitation, he opened fire on the driver. From what she remembered, the driver of that car was shot. She believed he was killed. The moment the shooting started, my mum reacted immediately. She told all of the children in the car to duck down. She also told their driver to get down as much as he could and leave the area as quickly as possible. The driver didn't hesitate. As soon as he had the opportunity, he drove away from the intersection as fast as he safely could. Thankfully, no one followed them. They managed to get away. As my mum told the story, everything suddenly clicked into place in my mind. The strange gunshots I had heard after finishing my prayer, the overwhelming feeling that something might have happened to them, the urge to call, then seeing the expressions on their faces when they returned home. None of it made any sense, yet somehow it all seemed connected. The following day, we saw the incident reported on the news. The reports confirmed that someone had been shot at that intersection. As far as I remember, the person who had been attacked died from the shooting. Hearing that on the news made the entire experience feel even more real. To this day, I still don't know what I heard after my prayer. I don't know why I was the only one who heard those faint gunshots. I don't know why my thoughts immediately went to my mum and my sisters while they were out. There may be a perfectly ordinary explanation, or there may not. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that shortly after I heard what sounded like gunfire beside my ear, my family found themselves only a few feet away from a man carrying an AK-style rifle who opened fire on another driver while they sat at a red light. Thankfully, my mum kept everyone calm, acted quickly, and told the driver to leave as soon as he could. Because of that, they all made it home safely. Even now, years later, I still think back to that afternoon. The sound I heard lasted only a moment, but the memory of it and the events that followed has stayed with me ever since. I was in my early 20s when this happened, and even now it's one of those memories that I can't fully explain. I've gone over it in my mind countless times, trying to convince myself there had to be a logical reason for what I saw. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. Either way, the feeling it left behind has never completely faded. It was an ordinary day, or at least it started that way. I was upstairs in my room, sitting at my computer. Like most people my age, I spent a lot of time there. Whether I was browsing the internet, playing games, or just passing the time, it was my usual place to relax. The room sat at the top of a staircase. My bedroom door wasn't completely closed. It was open just a few inches, enough that I could see part of the hallway and the landing outside. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see the entire upstairs, but I had a clear view of the narrow gap between the door and the frame. Everything around me was quiet. I don't remember hearing anyone else moving around the house. There wasn't a television playing downstairs or any other sounds that stood out. It was just a calm, uneventful afternoon, and I was focused on whatever I was doing on the computer. Then something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement outside my bedroom door. At first, I assumed someone had walked past. It was only a quick glimpse, the kind of motion you instinctively notice without really thinking about it. My eyes shifted toward the doorway almost automatically. That's when I saw it. A dark figure moved past the opening. It didn't simply pass by. It seemed to slow down just enough to lean toward the gap in the door. For a brief moment, it looked as though it was peeking into my room. The image lasted only an instant, but I remember one detail with complete clarity. Its eyes. They were red. Not bright enough to light up the room or anything dramatic like that, but unmistakably red. That single detail is what has stayed with me all these years. I froze. For a split second, my brain struggled to process what I had just seen. I stared toward the doorway, trying to make sense of it. Had someone really been standing there? Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? I honestly couldn't tell. But before I had time to think logically, something much stronger took over. Fear, not ordinary nervousness. Not the kind of fear you feel after watching a scary movie. This was immediate, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. Every instinct I had suddenly screamed that I was in serious danger. I've never experienced anything quite like it before or since. There wasn't any conscious reasoning behind it. I didn't stop to analyze what I'd seen. I didn't investigate. I didn't call out to see if someone was there. The fear hit me so hard that I reacted without thinking. I jumped out of my chair and ran. I rushed out of my room and headed straight downstairs as fast as I could. Looking back, I know my reaction probably seemed completely irrational. At the time, though, it felt like the only thing I could do. Once downstairs, I immediately grabbed a knife. Then I called for my dog. Having my dog beside me made me feel at least a little less vulnerable, even if only psychologically. With the knife in one hand and my dog close by, I stood there trying to calm myself enough to think. My heart was racing. Every sound suddenly seemed important. I listened carefully, expecting to hear footsteps or some sign that another person was in the house. Nothing. The house remained quiet. My dog didn't seem to react to anything unusual. There was no barking toward the stairs, no growling, no obvious indication that anyone else was there. That only made the situation more confusing. Part of me wanted to believe I'd simply misunderstood what I'd seen. Another part of me couldn't let go of the overwhelming certainty I'd felt only moments before. Eventually, after standing there for a while, I worked up the courage to check the rest of the house. I moved carefully from room to room, still holding the knife. I checked the downstairs first. Everything looked normal. Then, with much more hesitation, I made my way back upstairs. The hallway outside my bedroom was empty. There was no one there. Nothing appeared to be out of place. I looked around every corner, expecting to find some explanation for what had happened. There wasn't one. No signs that anyone had entered the house. No evidence that someone had been standing outside my door. Nothing at all. Eventually, I put the knife away and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. Life returned to normal. But the memory didn't. What has stayed with me all these years isn't simply the image of the dark figure or the red eyes. It's the fear. I've been startled plenty of times in my life. I've had moments where something unexpected made me jump. This wasn't like that. The fear arrived instantly and completely, as though some part of me believed I was facing immediate danger before my conscious mind had even caught up. It overrode logic. It overrode reason. It made me react in a way that, looking back, seems completely irrational. Yet, in that moment, grabbing a knife and finding my dog felt like the only reasonable response. I've often wondered whether my mind misinterpreted an ordinary shadow or whether my peripheral vision created something that wasn't really there. Those explanations certainly make sense, but no explanation has ever accounted for the overwhelming sense of dread that came with it. That feeling was unlike anything I've experienced before or since. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary reason for everything I saw. Maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know. All I know is that one quiet day in my early 20s, while sitting alone at my computer with my bedroom door slightly open, I caught sight of a dark figure peeking through the doorway. For the briefest moment, I remember seeing red eyes looking back at me. Whether what I saw was real or not, the fear certainly was. Even now, years later, I can still picture that partially open door, the movement just beyond it, and the split second when I became convinced that something outside my room was watching me. I was staying at a very old hotel in Norway, one of those places that seemed to carry the weight of centuries in its walls. It wasn't a modern building that had been decorated to look historic. It genuinely felt old in every possible way. The wooden floors creaked beneath your feet, the staircases had been worn smooth by countless visitors, and every room seemed to hold a quiet reminder that generations of people had passed through long before you ever arrived. It was the kind of hotel that had character. Everywhere you looked, there were antique furnishings, faded paintings, heavy wooden doors, and long corridors that seemed to stretch farther than they should. During the day, it felt charming and full of history. At night, though, it became something else entirely. The building grew incredibly quiet once most of the guests had settled into their rooms. Sounds carried through the old hallways in strange ways, making it difficult to tell whether footsteps or voices were nearby or somewhere much farther away. One evening, I realized I was hungry and decided to head down to the dining hall. I hadn't spent enough time in the hotel to know my way around very well. The layout was more confusing than I expected, with hallways branching off in different directions and staircases connecting sections of the building that didn't seem to follow any logical pattern. Still, I figured I'd eventually find the restaurant. As I wandered through the corridors, I heard what sounded like people talking somewhere ahead. It wasn't loud, just the quiet murmur of conversation. It sounded exactly like the kind of background noise you'd expect from a dining room where guests were finishing their evening meals. Without thinking much about it, I started following the sound. It seemed like the obvious thing to do. Every turn I made, the voices appeared to remain somewhere just ahead, never getting dramatically louder, but always sounding close enough that I assumed I was heading in the right direction. The hallway I found myself walking through looked different from the others. The lighting seemed dimmer, the decorations were older. Large pieces of antique furniture lined the walls. Heavy wooden cabinets, carved tables, and chairs that looked as though they had been sitting in the same places for decades, if not longer. Framed pictures covered the walls between the furniture. Some appeared to be landscapes. Others looked like old portraits. I didn't stop long enough to study them closely. At first, none of it struck me as particularly strange. After all, it was an old hotel. Old furniture belonged in an old hotel. Old paintings belonged there too. I simply kept following the sound of conversation. The farther I walked, however, the quieter everything else became. I realized I hadn't passed another guest in quite some time. No one stepped out of a room. No one walked toward me. No doors opened. The hallway felt strangely empty. The conversations I thought I was following never seemed to become any clearer. They remained distant, always just out of reach. I kept expecting to turn one final corner and find the dining hall filled with people enjoying dinner. Instead, I continued walking through corridor after corridor without seeing a single person. The silence around me became increasingly noticeable. It wasn't simply that there were no people nearby. It felt as though the entire section of the hotel had somehow been abandoned. Even the normal sounds of an old building seemed absent. No footsteps, no doors closing, no dishes clattering from a kitchen. Nothing. Eventually, I reached the very end of the hallway. The conversations had disappeared completely. Standing there, I found myself looking at a staircase leading downward. The stairs disappeared into a dark cellar below. There were no lights inviting guests downstairs, no signs pointing toward a restaurant, no sounds of people, just darkness and silence, complete silence. The feeling that came over me is difficult to describe, but it was immediate. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the result of seeing something frightening. I didn't see a ghost. I didn't hear footsteps behind me. Nothing jumped out at me. There was simply an overwhelming feeling that I should not be there. It arrived without warning. One moment I was standing at the top of those stairs. The next, every instinct I had was telling me to leave. Immediately. I stayed there only long enough to realize that I had absolutely no desire to find out what lay below. Then I turned around. At first, I walked quickly. Within seconds, that quick walk became something much faster. I retraced every step I'd taken through those empty corridors, moving with increasing speed as the uneasy feeling refused to leave me. I didn't run, but I came very close. I never looked behind me. I didn't want to. There wasn't any logical reason to think something was following me, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that remaining there any longer would be a mistake. The antique furniture that had seemed merely interesting on the way in now felt strangely unsettling. The old paintings lining the walls appeared different somehow, though I couldn't have said exactly why. The hallways seemed even longer than before. Every step echoed through the silence. I focused on getting back to the parts of the hotel where other people were. Eventually, I reached the more familiar corridors. Almost immediately, the atmosphere changed. I could hear ordinary sounds again. Voices, movement, life. Not long afterward, I finally found the dining hall. People were eating. Staff were moving between tables. The normal sounds of conversation filled the room. It felt almost impossible to believe that only minutes earlier I had been wandering through hallways that seemed completely disconnected from the rest of the hotel. At dinner, I mentioned to a friend that I'd managed to get lost while trying to find the restaurant. I described the strange hallway, the antique furniture, the pictures, the staircase leading down into the dark cellar, and the overwhelming feeling that had convinced me to leave. Before I had even finished describing it, my friend looked at me with a curious expression. Then they smiled slightly. "Oh," they said, "that place is known to be haunted." I thought they were joking. They weren't. Apparently the hotel had quite a reputation. According to my friend, it wasn't exactly a secret either. It's on the brochure. I just stared at them. I hadn't read the brochure. No one had mentioned anything when I checked in. Until that moment, I had absolutely no idea the hotel was considered haunted. Whatever I had felt in those hallways hadn't been influenced by stories or expectations because I hadn't heard any. As far as I knew, I had simply taken a wrong turn while looking for dinner. Learning about the hotel's reputation afterward made the experience far more unsettling than it had already been. Naturally, my curiosity got the better of me. Over the next day or two, I ended up talking with some of the hotel staff. I didn't bring it up expecting much. I assumed they would laugh it off or tell me that every old hotel collects ghost stories over the years. Instead, they nodded as though they'd heard similar experiences many times before. One member of the staff shared a story they claimed had happened to them personally. Another mentioned incidents that had been passed down by employees who had worked there long before they had. Then someone else added another story, and another. It quickly became clear that nearly everyone working there had either experienced something unusual themselves or knew someone who had. Some stories involved unexplained footsteps, others described voices. A few centered around parts of the hotel that guests rarely visited anymore. Several involved that older section of the building. The details varied from person to person, but the common thread remained the same. The hotel had a long history of strange experiences. Whether those stories were true or simply part of the building's folklore, I couldn't say. I never witnessed anything supernatural myself. I never saw an apparition. Nothing touched me. Nothing spoke directly to me. The only thing that happened was that I accidentally wandered into the wrong part of an old hotel while following what I believed were the sounds of conversation. Yet the memory has stayed with me for years. Not because of anything I saw, because of what I felt. That overwhelming certainty at the top of those cellar stairs remains one of the strongest instincts I've ever experienced. It arrived without explanation. It didn't build gradually. It simply appeared all at once, telling me that I needed to leave. To this day, I can't explain why the hallway felt so different from the rest of the hotel. Maybe it was simply the isolation. Maybe the silence. Maybe the age of that forgotten part of the building. Or maybe hearing about the hotel's reputation afterward caused the memory to take on a life of its own. I honestly don't know. All I know is that I set out looking for dinner, following what sounded like ordinary conversation through the halls of an old hotel in Norway. Instead, I found empty corridors filled with antique furniture, aging portraits, and a staircase disappearing into a dark cellar where every sound suddenly vanished. I listened to the feeling that told me to turn around. Only later did I learn that countless other people believed that same part of the hotel had never really been empty at all. In 2012, during my senior year of college, I had the chance to visit Japan. One afternoon, I decided to go to a small, old movie theater that was showing a collection of animated shorts. The theater itself wasn't anything like the large multiplexes I was used to. It was much smaller, older, and had a quiet charm that made it feel like it belonged to another era. The building looked as though it had been standing for decades, carefully preserved despite the years that had passed. Everything inside reflected that age, from the worn wooden floors to the rows of connected wooden seats that had clearly been used by generations of moviegoers. The screening I wanted to see was a Studio Ghibli animated short. I had always loved animation, and the opportunity to watch a Ghibli short in Japan felt special. That alone was enough reason to visit the theater. When I entered the auditorium, I immediately noticed that I was one of the oldest people there. Most of the seats were filled with children. Parents were scattered throughout the audience, but there were definitely more kids than adults. That made sense, considering the film was intended for younger viewers. I didn't think much of it. I found my seat, settled in, and waited for the lights to dim. The atmosphere was cheerful before the movie began. Children whispered excitedly to one another, parents quietly reminded them to settle down, and the room carried that familiar sense of anticipation that always comes just before the screen lights up. Soon the lights faded, and the movie started. For the first few moments, everything was exactly as I had expected. Then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A little girl was sitting to my right. At first I realized she was looking at me. I didn't immediately think anything was wrong. I assumed she was simply curious. As a foreign visitor, I knew I probably looked a little different from what some children in that area were used to seeing. It didn't seem unreasonable that a child might glance over a few times out of curiosity. So I ignored it and focused back on the movie. A minute or two later, I noticed she was still looking at me. Not just occasional glances. She was staring. I tried to keep watching the film, but it became increasingly difficult to ignore. Every time I became aware of her again, she was still facing me. Her expression didn't really change. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't frowning. She simply looked at me with a completely blank expression. I started feeling uncomfortable. Still, I told myself it probably wasn't a big deal. She was just a child. Children sometimes stare without realizing they're making someone uncomfortable. I decided the best thing to do was simply ignore it. I didn't want to distract anyone around us, especially since everyone had come to enjoy the movie. As the animated short continued, something changed. The little girl shifted in her seat. Instead of sitting normally and occasionally looking in my direction, she climbed onto her knees. Then she turned her entire body toward me. Now she wasn't just glancing sideways. She was fully facing me. She continued staring directly at me without saying a single word. The blank expression never changed. That was the moment when my discomfort really began to grow. I tried to focus on the movie playing on the screen. I really did. After all, I'd come specifically to see the Studio Ghibli short. But every few seconds I found myself wondering if she was still looking at me. Whenever I checked from the corner of my eye, she was exactly the same. Still kneeling, still facing me, still staring. It became almost impossible to pay attention to what was happening in the film. Instead of following the story, my thoughts drifted somewhere else entirely. I started wondering whether I should say something after the movie ended. I didn't want to be rude. I certainly didn't want to upset a child. At the same time, I thought it might be worth politely mentioning it to her parents. Not in an angry way, just enough to let them know that staring at strangers for such a long time could make people uncomfortable. I mentally rehearsed different ways of saying it. Maybe I'd simply smile and explain that she had been watching me throughout the film. Maybe I'd laugh it off so it wouldn't sound confrontational. I wasn't even sure whether I would actually say anything. I just kept thinking about it because it was becoming harder and harder to ignore her. Throughout all of this, she never seemed to lose interest. She never turned back toward the screen, at least, not that I noticed. Every time I became aware of her again, she appeared to be in exactly the same position, facing me, watching me, completely silent. The movie itself only lasted about 30 minutes. Being an animated short, it ended much sooner than a typical feature film. Eventually, the final scene faded from the screen. The credits finished. Then, the lights came back on. As the room gradually brightened, people began gathering their belongings. Children stood up. Parents started helping them toward the aisles. I finally decided it was time to deal with the situation. I turned to my right. I expected to find the little girl exactly where she had been sitting for the past half hour. Instead, I found myself looking directly at a wall. For a second, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The wall was covered in red wallpaper, decorated with small, cute animal designs. It looked perfectly ordinary. What wasn't ordinary was how close it was. There wasn't enough room for anyone to have been sitting between me and that wall. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Then I looked down. The row of wooden seats was connected together as one long piece. My own seat was exactly where I remembered it being. To my left, the row continued normally. But to my right, there wasn't another seat. There couldn't have been. The only thing remaining was a tiny piece of wood attached near the armrest. It looked as though another chair had once existed there years earlier before being removed. Only a small remnant remained. Maybe 2 centimeters of the original seat were still attached. That was all. There was no space where a child could have been sitting. No gap, no movable chair, nothing, just the wall. I looked again to make sure I hadn't somehow mistaken where I was sitting. The red wallpaper with its cheerful animal designs was still right beside me. The connected wooden seats made it obvious that there had never been another usable chair there. The theater may once have been slightly wider, but if that had been the case, it had been renovated long before I arrived. Whatever seat might have existed there had been cut away, leaving only a small fragment behind. I just stood there for a moment. The noise of everyone else leaving the theater continued around me. Children chatted happily about the movie. Parents gathered coats and bags. Everything sounded perfectly normal. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop staring at the wall. I tried to remember exactly what had happened during the screening. Had I somehow imagined the entire thing? That didn't seem possible. I'd spent almost the entire 30 minutes distracted by the little girl beside me. I had watched her move onto her knees. I had noticed her turning to face me completely. I had spent the entire movie planning what I might politely say afterward. Those weren't vague memories. They were specific, clear, detailed, yet now there was nowhere she could possibly have been sitting. I looked around to see if perhaps she had simply been seated somewhere else, and I'd become confused in the darkness. Nothing explained it. There wasn't another child nearby who resembled the one I remembered. There wasn't an empty seat. That would have made sense. The wall remained exactly where it had apparently always been. I didn't know what to do. There wasn't really anyone I could ask. What would I even say? That I had spent half an hour sitting beside someone who couldn't possibly have been there? It sounded ridiculous even inside my own head. So I didn't say anything. I simply gathered my things. I walked out of the theater with everyone else. Outside, life continued as normal. People came and went. The streets were busy. Nothing else unusual happened that day. But the experience stayed with me. Even now, I can remember the feeling of trying to ignore that unwavering stare while attempting to enjoy the movie. I can remember silently planning a polite conversation that never happened. Most clearly of all, I remember turning toward my right when the lights came on, expecting to see a little girl staring back at me one last time. Instead, I found only a red wall, covered with cheerful little animals and the tiny wooden remnant of a seat that no longer existed. I still don't know how to explain it. Maybe there was something about the darkness of the theater that confused my sense of space. Maybe there was an explanation I simply failed to notice in the moment. Or maybe there are experiences that don't fit neatly into ordinary logic. I honestly can't say. All I know is that I walked into that little theater in Japan, expecting nothing more than a quiet afternoon watching a Studio Ghibli animated short. Instead, I spent 30 minutes distracted by the silent attention of a little girl sitting beside me. When the lights came back on, there was no little girl. There wasn't even a seat. I've always loved tulips. Even when I was a teenager, they were my favorite flower. My grandmother knew that better than anyone. She had a habit of saving little things that made her think of the people she loved. If she saw an interesting newspaper clipping, a funny cartoon, or a beautiful photograph that reminded her of one of her grandchildren, she'd carefully cut it out and save it. That was simply who she was. One day, while I was still a teenager, she came across a newspaper photograph of a tulip festival. The picture showed hundreds of colorful tulips stretching out across a field. She saved it for me because she knew how much I loved them. It wasn't an expensive gift. It wasn't anything extraordinary. It was simply a thoughtful little gesture that meant a great deal to me. I framed the picture and kept it. Years passed. Life changed. My grandmother eventually passed away. By the time this happened, she had been gone for around 15 years. I had moved to another state. I was married. From the outside, everything probably looked perfectly normal. Behind closed doors, though, my marriage was falling apart. At the time, I was only just beginning to admit that to myself. It was one of the hardest periods of my life. My husband was away on a trip, leaving me alone in the house with my thoughts. I spent hours thinking about what would happen if I left him. I worried about how he would react. I worried about whether I'd be able to support myself. I questioned everything: fear, anger, sadness, grief, uncertainty. It all seemed to arrive at once. I didn't know what to do with those feelings, so I cleaned. Stress cleaning has always been my way of coping. Some people go for long walks. Some people cry. I apparently rage vacuum. That day was no exception. I was vacuuming the house while crying almost non-stop. The framed picture of the tulips still hung in the entry hallway. It had been there for years. The frame itself wasn't in great condition anymore. It was a little awkward to handle. Because of the way it hung on the wall, you couldn't simply bump it off the nail. To remove it, you actually had to lift it upward before pulling it away from the wall. It wasn't loose, it wasn't unstable. Even taking it down on purpose required a little effort. As I vacuumed near the hallway, I found myself looking toward the picture. My eyes settled on it while I stood there crying, overwhelmed by everything happening in my life. At that exact moment, something happened. The picture moved. It didn't simply slide off the nail. It couldn't have. Instead, it shifted sideways. Then it seemed to lift slightly upward. Only after that did it fall to the floor. I stood there completely still. For a moment I felt strangely dizzy, not terrified, just deeply unsettled. I'd watched it happen with my own eyes. Even now, years later, I can still picture the movement. It wasn't how gravity should have worked. It wasn't the way something accidentally falls from a wall. The picture landed on the floor. I just stared at it. Almost immediately, a single thought entered my mind. My grandmother. Now, my grandmother was a wonderful person, but she wasn't what most people would describe as a particularly gentle or sweet old lady. She loved her family fiercely. She protected us, and she had absolutely no patience for anyone who mistreated the people she cared about. If she'd known someone was hurting one of her grandchildren, kindness would not have been her first response. That simply wasn't who she was. Standing there in the hallway, I suddenly felt as though she somehow knew exactly what I was going through. Whether that feeling came from grief, memory, or something else entirely, I can't say. Without really thinking about it, I quietly said out loud, "It's okay, Grandma, I'll be all right." The words came naturally, as though I were answering someone who had asked whether I was okay. I bent down and picked up the picture. Remarkably, it hadn't broken, not even the glass. I carried it back to the wall. Just as it always had been, the frame was awkward to hang. I actually had to struggle a little to lift it into exactly the right position before it finally settled back onto the nail. That only reinforced what I'd already been thinking. It simply wasn't the kind of frame that should have fallen the way it had. After that, nothing else happened. There were no strange noises, no more moving objects, no mysterious experiences. Life simply continued. But something inside me had changed. Oddly enough, I felt calmer, not because I believed I'd witnessed a ghost. I still don't know what happened that day. There could easily have been an explanation I never found. Old frames warp, walls shift. Gravity sometimes surprises us in ways we don't expect. I understand all of that. Even so, I can't shake the feeling I had in that moment. It felt as though my grandmother had somehow reminded me of the kind of woman she had always been. Strong, protective, completely unwilling to tolerate anyone treating her family badly. Whether that message came from my own subconscious or from somewhere I can't explain, honestly doesn't matter to me anymore. What mattered was what I did afterward. I stopped accepting a situation that was making me miserable. Eventually, I left that marriage. The divorce wasn't easy, but it was the right decision. Years later, I met someone else. Today, I'm happily remarried. My life is peaceful. I'm married to someone who treats me with kindness and respect, as I sometimes jokingly put it. I'm now in a completely bullshit-free marriage with a decidedly non-turd husband. Whenever I see tulips now, I still think of my grandmother. I remember the newspaper clipping she carefully saved for me all those years ago. I remember standing alone in my hallway, crying while pushing a vacuum cleaner back and forth. And I remember the old framed picture lifting in a way I still can't explain before gently falling to the floor. Whether it was coincidence, faulty hardware, or one last quiet reminder from the woman who never let anyone push her family around, I'll probably never know. But I'd like to think that, in the moment I needed her most, Grandma found one last way to tell me exactly what she always would have said. Don't put up with it. You'll be all right. A quick pause before we go on. If you're new here, welcome, and if calm horror stories help you relax, I'd be happy to see you again. Subscribe if you'd like. Now, back into the Sleepy Shadows scary stories. Looking back over the years, my family has experienced several moments that still leave us wondering whether intuition can sometimes warn us about things we can't possibly know. I can't prove that any of these events were anything more than extraordinary coincidences, but after 3 separate experiences, it's difficult not to think about them from time to time. The first happened in 2013. My mom had been visiting family in the Philippines and was flying back to the United States. Like many international trips, her journey included a layover in Seoul before boarding the final flight home. Everything about the trip had gone according to plan. She arrived at the airport in Seoul with enough time to catch her connecting flight, which was supposed to be Asiana Airlines Flight 214. It was a routine connection, and there was no reason to think anything unusual was about to happen. While she was waiting at the airport, my dad contacted her. At first, it seemed like a perfectly ordinary conversation between a husband and wife. He started asking questions about the house, the security system, important documents, and a variety of other things that suddenly seemed urgent to him. The questions just kept coming. Every time my mom tried to wrap up the conversation, my dad thought of something else he wanted to ask. None of the topics were emergencies, yet he felt an overwhelming need to keep talking to her. He later admitted that he couldn't explain why. He simply had a strong feeling that he needed to keep her occupied. At the time, my mom didn't understand why he wouldn't let the conversation end. She became increasingly frustrated because the discussion dragged on much longer than she expected. By the time she finally ended the conversation and headed toward her gate, it was too late. She had missed her flight. Naturally, she was upset. Missing an international flight meant she had to wait until the following day for another one. Instead of arriving home as planned, she was stuck at the airport trying to rearrange her travel. She wasn't happy about it. From her perspective, the delay felt completely unnecessary. Meanwhile, my dad still couldn't explain why he had insisted on keeping her on the phone. He only knew that, for some reason, he hadn't wanted the conversation to end. Later, we learned what had happened. The flight my mom was originally supposed to board, Asiana Airlines Flight 214, crashed while attempting to land in San Francisco. Many passengers were injured. Several people lost their lives. Hearing that news completely changed the way our family looked at that missed connection. What had seemed like an incredibly frustrating inconvenience only hours earlier suddenly became something else entirely. None of us have ever forgotten it. A few years later, in 2016, something remarkably similar happened again. That summer, my sister, several friends, and I planned a month-long girls' trip to Orlando. We had been looking forward to it for months. The trip included everything we wanted to do. We planned to attend MegaCon 2016, spend several days at the theme parks, enjoy the nightlife, and simply relax together. The convention came first, and we had an amazing time. After MegaCon ended, we gathered to plan the rest of our schedule. One of the biggest discussions centered around the order of our activities. Some of our friends wanted to spend the first week of June visiting the theme parks and save the clubs for the second week. Among the places everyone wanted to visit was Pulse nightclub. It was one of the clubs our group had been excited about experiencing while we were in Orlando. The proposed schedule seemed perfectly reasonable. Theme parks first, clubs later. For most of us, the order didn't really matter. Then my sister surprised everyone. She strongly insisted that we reverse the schedule. Instead of waiting until the second week for the nightlife, she wanted us to go clubbing first and visit the theme parks afterward. She felt unusually strongly about it. It wasn't simply a casual suggestion. She kept insisting that we switch the order. The rest of us didn't really understand why it mattered so much, but eventually we agreed. It wasn't worth arguing over. So we changed the plans. We spent our first week enjoying the clubs. Pulse was one of the places we visited during that time. Everything about the night felt completely normal. We had fun together, enjoyed ourselves, and eventually continued with the rest of our vacation. Afterward, we moved on to the theme parks as originally planned, just in the opposite order. 8 days after we had been at Pulse, everything changed. The nightclub became the site of one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. The news was devastating. The realization that we had been there only 8 days earlier left all of us shaken. Had we followed the original schedule instead of changing it, there's a real possibility that we could have been there that night. Just 2 days before the attack at Pulse, we had already been saddened by the news that singer Christina Grimmie had been killed in Orlando. At the time, that tragedy already made the city feel different. Then, when the shooting at Pulse happened, it completely changed the atmosphere. The vacation no longer felt enjoyable. After everything that had happened, we decided to end the trip early. We packed our things and went home. It simply didn't feel right to stay. By then, 2 separate events had left our family wondering about those strange feelings people sometimes experience without any obvious reason. Still, we tried not to read too much into them. Then another experience happened in 2017. Every year, my husband and I made a trip to Las Vegas. It had become one of our favorite traditions. We enjoyed spending time there together, and planning the trip was something we always looked forward to. That year, my husband suggested spending a week there from late September into early October. The dates worked well on paper. There wasn't any obvious reason to change them. Unlike the previous experiences, I didn't have an overwhelming sense of dread. There wasn't any sudden panic or urgency. Instead, something much quieter happened. While talking on the phone with my mom about the trip, the dates came up in conversation. Almost immediately, both of us felt strangely uncomfortable with them. Neither of us could explain why. There wasn't any logical concern. Nothing had happened that would make those dates seem unusual. Even so, both of us shared the same unexplained feeling. We simply didn't like that particular week. The feeling wasn't dramatic. It was just persistent enough that I couldn't ignore it. After thinking it over, I talked to my husband. I suggested moving the trip up by 1 week instead. Fortunately, he agreed. We adjusted our plans and traveled earlier than originally intended. The vacation was wonderful. We had a great time, just as we always did. Nothing unusual happened while we were there. Eventually, we returned home. 3 days after we left Las Vegas, everything changed. The Harvest Music Festival shooting took place on the Las Vegas Strip. Like millions of other people, we watched the news in complete disbelief. As more details became available, we realized something deeply unsettling. When we compared our original travel plans with the timeline of the attack, we discovered that, had we kept our original schedule, there was a very real chance we would have still been in Las Vegas. What disturbed me even more was another realization. By lining up the dates and locations, we discovered that during our trip, we had actually been inside the same building as the shooter while he was preparing for the attack. At the time, we had absolutely no idea. He was simply another person somewhere in the building. Nothing seemed unusual. We went about our vacation completely unaware of what would happen only days later. Learning that afterward was incredibly unsettling. Even now, thinking about it sends a chill through me. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on these three experiences. In every case, there are perfectly reasonable explanations. People change travel plans all the time. Flights are missed. Schedules get rearranged. Vacations are moved. Most of the time, nothing remarkable comes of it. Coincidences happen more often than we realize. I understand that. Still, it's difficult not to think about the strange feelings that seem to influence each decision. My dad couldn't explain why he kept my mom talking until she missed her flight. My sister couldn't explain why she cared so deeply about reversing our Orlando schedule. My mom and I couldn't explain why those Las Vegas dates felt wrong. None of us had any information that could have predicted what would happen afterward. There were no warnings, no rumors, no signs that would have justified changing our plans. Just feelings that, at the time, didn't make much sense. Whether those experiences were extraordinary coincidences or something none of us can fully explain, I honestly don't know. I don't claim they were supernatural. I don't claim anyone had a premonition. All I know is that 3 separate times, seemingly ordinary decisions altered our plans in ways that kept members of my family away from places where unimaginable tragedies unfolded only days, or, in one case, only hours, later to this day. Whenever someone in my family gets one of those strange, unshakable feelings that can't quite be explained, none of us are very quick to dismiss it anymore. Me and my partner had been together for 17 years when we finally made a dream come true in 2016. We moved out to an acreage, far from the noise of town, surrounded by open fields, old trees, and quiet mornings. It was everything he had ever wanted. From the moment we arrived, it felt like he had found the place where he truly belonged. He threw himself into the work with an energy I hadn't seen in years. He loved every inch of that property, whether he was fixing fences, caring for the horses, walking through the fields, or simply standing outside with a cup of coffee watching the sunrise. He seemed completely at peace. The land became part of him. He knew every corner of it, every tree, every trail, every change in the weather. He could spend hours outside without ever feeling bored. Even the smallest jobs made him happy because they were done on his own little piece of the world. Seeing him so content made me happy too. Our dog loved the space just as much as we did, racing through the grass with endless energy, while the horses settled into their new home as if they had always belonged there. Life felt slower, quieter, and simpler. We finally had the kind of home we'd talked about for years. For a while, everything seemed exactly as it should be. But sometimes, old problems don't disappear just because life changes. For many years, he had managed to keep his drinking under control. It wasn't something he liked talking about, and for a long time, it stayed buried beneath the surface. I believed he had left it behind. Then, little by little, it found its way back. At first, the changes were so small that they were easy to ignore. A few extra drinks here and there, longer evenings, excuses that sounded believable enough. I kept hoping it was only temporary, something that would pass on its own. Instead, it grew worse. The man who had been so full of life when we moved to the acreage slowly began slipping away. His smile became harder to find. The excitement he once had for the farm faded. Jobs that he had once looked forward to sat unfinished. I watched someone I loved disappear a little more every day. There were good days that gave me hope, followed by bad days that erased it all over again. It became an exhausting cycle that neither of us seemed able to escape. No matter how much I wanted to help him, I couldn't fight that battle for him. His decline happened much faster than I ever imagined it would. By the time January 2020 arrived, everything had changed. That was the month he took his own life. There really aren't words that can describe what that kind of loss feels like. One moment your entire future exists, and the next it's simply gone. The acreage didn't feel like home anymore. It felt impossibly quiet. Every fence reminded me of him because he had built or repaired most of them himself. Every trail held memories of us walking together. His truck still sat where he had left it, and every time I saw it, I expected him to come walking around the corner. But he never did. The horses still waited to be fed. The dog still wandered around the yard looking for him. Life kept moving, even though mine felt completely frozen. I fell into a depression deeper than anything I had ever experienced. Getting out of bed became difficult. Some days I barely spoke to anyone. The silence around the property felt heavier than it ever had before. I cried every single day. Sometimes it happened without warning. I'd be washing dishes or feeding the horses when something would remind me of him, and suddenly I couldn't hold the tears back anymore. The loneliness was overwhelming. Weeks passed like that. Then, near the end of March 2020, something unexpected happened. One morning I noticed a small black rabbit on the property. At first, I didn't think much of it. Rabbits aren't exactly rare, especially in the countryside. I assumed it would pass through the yard, nibble on a bit of grass, and disappear back into the fields. But it didn't. The little rabbit stayed. Day after day, I kept seeing it. It never seemed interested in leaving the property. Instead, it made itself completely at home. One of the first things I noticed was where it liked to sleep. Every night it curled up underneath my husband's truck. Out of all the places it could have chosen, that was where it returned again and again. It wasn't hiding there because it was frightened. It simply seemed comfortable, almost as though it had decided that was where it belonged. As the days went by, I started noticing even stranger habits. The rabbit dug a small burrow directly beneath our bedroom window, not somewhere out in the fields, not beneath a tree, right beneath the window where my husband and I had spent countless nights together. Every morning I'd look outside and see the little black rabbit nearby. Sometimes it would be sitting perfectly still. Other times it would be quietly moving through the yard, never wandering very far. It gradually became part of daily life. Our dog absolutely adored it. I expected chasing. Instead, I watched them play together. The rabbit never seemed frightened of him, and the dog never acted aggressively. They simply shared the yard as though they had known each other forever. Watching them together always made me smile, even during the hardest days. The horses seemed comfortable around it too. Whenever I went out to check on them, the rabbit was often nearby. It would wander through the pasture or sit quietly while the horses grazed, never appearing nervous. The horses accepted its presence without hesitation. Everything about it felt peaceful. I found myself taking photos whenever I saw it. Eventually, I started recording videos too. There was something special about this tiny animal. I couldn't really explain why. It wasn't doing anything extraordinary. It was simply there, always nearby, always part of the farm. When I look back now, I realize just how often that little rabbit appeared during the months when I needed comfort the most. Whenever I stepped outside feeling especially lost, It somehow seemed to be there. Sometimes it was sitting beneath the truck. Sometimes it was near the horses. Sometimes it appeared close to the house. It never seemed in a hurry. It simply shared the space with me. Then I remembered something that had happened years before. Long before we ever moved to the acreage, my husband had visited a native elder for a reading. It wasn't something either of us talked about often, but I remembered one detail with complete clarity. The elder had told him that his spirit animal was a rabbit. At the time, neither of us thought very much about it. It was simply an interesting moment that stayed tucked away in the back of our minds. But after his death, after the appearance of this little black rabbit, that memory returned with surprising force. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Out of every animal that might have wandered onto our property, why a rabbit? Why one that refused to leave? Why one that slept beneath his truck? Why one that made its home beneath our bedroom window? Why one that spent its days with the dog he loved and the horses he cared for so deeply? Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe it had simply found a safe place to live. Maybe everything I noticed was nothing more than coincidence. I know that's entirely possible. But standing there alone on that property, with grief following me everywhere I went, it became difficult not to wonder. It felt as though something familiar was still close by. Not in a frightening way, never threatening, never unsettling. If anything, the feeling was comforting. The rabbit's quiet presence eased something inside me that I hadn't realized was beginning to heal. The days slowly became a little more manageable. I still missed him every moment. That never changed. But eventually I wasn't crying from the moment I woke up until I went to bed. Some afternoons I caught myself smiling again. I started spending more time outside instead of hiding indoors. The acreage slowly became home once more instead of feeling like a place filled only with memories. Without realizing it, I had begun moving forward, not forgetting, just learning how to live with the loss. Then, sometime in late July, I noticed something different. The rabbit wasn't there. I looked beneath the truck. Nothing. I checked near the bedroom window. The little burrow was quiet. I walked around the property, expecting to see that familiar black shape somewhere in the grass. It never appeared. Days passed. Then weeks. I never saw it again. Its disappearance happened just as quietly as its arrival. No signs, no explanation. It simply left. Looking back now, the timing has always stayed with me. It arrived during the darkest period of my life, when I cried every single day and felt completely broken. It stayed through those difficult months, quietly becoming part of my daily routine. Then, once I had started laughing again, once I had begun enjoying life in small ways and carrying on without breaking down every day, it was gone. Maybe it was only a wild rabbit that happened to choose our property for a few months before moving on. That explanation makes perfect sense. But another part of me has never been able to let go of a different possibility. I still think about that reading years earlier, about the elder who told my husband that his spirit animal was a rabbit. And I still think about the little black rabbit that appeared when I needed comfort more than anything else, sleeping beneath his truck, making its home beneath our window, spending time with his dog and his horses, and quietly remaining by my side until I was finally able to stand on my own again. I can't prove that it was him. Maybe no one ever could. But deep down, I've always believed that my husband came back one last time to check on the place he loved so much, to make sure his farm was still cared for, to see that his horses were safe, to spend a little more time with his faithful dog, and, perhaps most of all, to make sure that I was going to be okay before he finally said goodbye. My grandmother has traveled all over the world. Long before I was old enough to appreciate how incredible that was, she had already visited countries that most people only ever read about. She loved exploring new places, learning about different cultures, and seeing as much of the world as she possibly could. Traveling wasn't just something she enjoyed every now and then. It was one of the biggest parts of her life. Out of all the stories she shared from those trips, one has stayed with me more than any other. It wasn't about a beautiful landmark. It wasn't about meeting someone famous or witnessing a historic event. Instead, it was about a single bridge in a country far from home. She told me that during one of her overseas trips, she was having a wonderful time. Everything about the vacation had been going well. She was enjoying herself, exploring the area, taking in the scenery, and doing what she always loved to do whenever she visited a new place. There was nothing unusual about that particular day. She wasn't upset. She wasn't feeling sick. She wasn't thinking about anything sad. As far as she could remember, she was simply walking through the city like any other tourist, taking in the sights around her. Eventually, she came to a bridge. She had never seen it before. There was nothing that made it stand out from countless other bridges she had crossed during her travels. It wasn't a place she had planned to visit specifically, and it wasn't somewhere she recognized. It was simply part of the route she happened to be walking. She stepped onto the bridge and started crossing. Then something happened that completely caught her by surprise. Without any warning, she was overwhelmed by emotion. She didn't gradually become emotional. It happened all at once. She suddenly burst into tears, not just watery eyes or a few quiet tears. She started crying uncontrollably. The emotion was so powerful that she couldn't stop it. She later told me that it didn't make any sense to her at the time. Nothing bad had happened. She wasn't thinking about a painful memory. She had been enjoying her trip only moments before. Yet as soon as she reached that particular bridge, it felt as though a wave of sadness had completely taken over. She tried to understand why she was reacting that way, but she couldn't. Then, almost as suddenly as the tears began, another feeling appeared. She said she remembered something. At least, that's the only way she knew how to describe it. It wasn't a memory from her childhood. It wasn't something from earlier in her adult life. She believed it was a memory from another life entirely. Standing on that bridge, she became convinced that she had been there before. Not during this lifetime. Another one. According to her, she suddenly remembered being a child who had fallen from that very bridge into the water below. She remembered drowning. She described it as something that felt less like imagining a story and more like remembering an event she had somehow forgotten. It was immediate, unexpected, deeply emotional. The feeling was so real that it left her standing there crying, unable to explain to herself what was happening. After a while, the overwhelming emotion slowly faded. She was eventually able to continue her walk, but she never forgot what had happened. The experience stayed with her long after the trip ended. When she told me the story years later, she wasn't confused or struggling with her memory. She was around 60 years old at the time. She was still active, still traveling, and still as sharp as anyone could hope to be. Even today, she's much older and remains incredibly sharp. Her memory is excellent. She still tells stories with remarkable detail and clarity. Because of that, I've never believed the experience had anything to do with dementia or failing memory. She never presented the story as absolute proof of anything, either. She simply told me exactly what she had experienced. What has always stood out to me is that it wasn't bridges in general that affected her. She had crossed countless bridges throughout her life. She had traveled across continents, visited cities around the world, and walked through places most people never get the chance to see. Nothing like this had ever happened before. And as far as I know, it never happened again. It was only that one bridge, one specific place. For reasons she could never explain, standing there triggered something unlike anything she had ever experienced. I've thought about the story many times over the years. There are plenty of possible explanations. Maybe something about the bridge unconsciously reminded her of another memory. Maybe the atmosphere, the scenery, or some small detail created an emotional response that she couldn't consciously identify. Or maybe it was something that simply can't be explained so easily. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that my grandmother has never been someone who enjoys making up stories just to impress people or frighten children. She wasn't dramatic by nature. She didn't tell ghost stories for entertainment. She simply shared an experience that had genuinely happened to her and admitted that she couldn't explain it. I've also never understood why she would invent something like that. There was nothing for her to gain. If anything, it was a strange and deeply personal experience that left her with more questions than answers. She wasn't trying to convince me that past lives are real. She wasn't trying to persuade me to believe anything. She was simply describing the strongest emotional experience she'd ever had while traveling. Whether what she experienced was truly a glimpse into a past life, an intense psychological response brought on by something she didn't consciously recognize, or a coincidence that happened to feel incredibly meaningful, I can't say. No one can. All I know is the story exactly as she told it. A woman who had spent years traveling all over the world walked across one ordinary-looking bridge in a foreign country. Without warning, she broke down in tears. In that moment, she became convinced she was remembering the life of a child who had once fallen from that very bridge and drowned. Out of every bridge she crossed before or afterward, only that one ever made her feel that way. She carried that memory with her for the rest of her life. And after hearing her tell the story, I've never been able to forget it either. One night, my wife and I were relaxing at home like we usually did after work. It wasn't a special evening. Nothing unusual had happened, and there wasn't any reason to think it would be different from any other night. We were talking, watching television, and simply enjoying a quiet evening together. Then, without any warning, something inside me changed. Out of nowhere, I was overwhelmed by an intense need to see my dad. It wasn't just the ordinary feeling of missing someone, or thinking that it had been too long since we'd gotten together. It was far stronger than that. The feeling arrived all at once, and it demanded my attention in a way I had never experienced before. I didn't need to see him that exact minute, but I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to see him very soon. The urgency was impossible to ignore. I've tried many times to explain what it felt like, but I still can't find the right words. It wasn't a thought that I could reason away, and it wasn't based on anything logical. It felt more like an overwhelming force pressing against me, refusing to let go. There was almost an anger to it. Not anger directed at anyone, but a fierce urgency that wouldn't allow me to push it aside. It was as though every part of me was insisting that I make plans to see him immediately. I'd never experienced anything like it before. I haven't experienced anything like it since. My dad lived about 20 minutes away, so seeing him wasn't difficult because of distance. The challenge was his schedule. He stayed busy most of the time, and dropping by without notice usually wasn't practical. If I wanted to see him, it generally had to be planned in advance. Normally, I would have accepted that and waited until another weekend or another convenient day. That night, waiting didn't feel like an option. The feeling became so strong that I picked up the phone and called him. I remember hoping he would answer. When he did, I tried to sound casual, even though nothing about the moment felt casual to me. I suggested getting together soon. We talked for a few minutes, and before long we agreed that he and my mom would come over for dinner the following evening. The moment we settled on those plans, I felt a small sense of relief. Not complete relief, just enough to quiet that strange urgency for a little while. When I hung up, my wife could probably tell something was different. I don't remember exactly what I told her, only that I couldn't shake the feeling that seeing my dad had suddenly become incredibly important. Even after making the plans, the feeling never completely disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, turning over for what felt like hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself wide awake again, only moments later. There wasn't any obvious reason for it. I wasn't worried about work. I wasn't anxious about anything I could identify. I simply couldn't rest. The hours crawled by. The house was quiet, but my mind refused to settle. I kept thinking about the dinner we had planned, though I couldn't have explained why it seemed so significant. Morning finally arrived. I got ready for work, hoping the strange feeling would disappear once I got busy. It didn't. The entire day felt wrong. I was distracted from the moment I walked into work. Conversations drifted past me without really registering. I struggled to focus on simple tasks that would normally require almost no effort. My coworkers probably noticed that something was off. I certainly did. It felt as though part of my attention was somewhere else all day long. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about the evening ahead, about seeing my parents, about sitting down together for dinner. The day seemed unusually long. When it finally ended, I headed home looking forward to their visit more than I normally would have. My parents arrived later that evening. The moment they walked through the door, the tension I'd been carrying eased just a little. Seeing both of them standing there somehow made everything feel normal again. We spent some time talking before dinner. Nothing dramatic happened. No one mentioned anything unusual. It was simply a pleasant evening with family. Looking back now, those ordinary moments are the ones I remember most clearly. There was no sense that anything terrible was about to happen. If anything, the evening felt especially peaceful. Just before dinner was ready, my dad and I stepped outside together. It wasn't for any particular reason. We simply found ourselves standing there in the fresh evening air. The weather was beautiful. The light was beginning to soften as the day slowly gave way to evening, and everything around us felt calm. For a few quiet moments, neither of us needed to say very much. Then, we noticed a flock of geese flying overhead. We both looked up. They crossed the sky together in perfect formation, their calls carrying through the air as they disappeared toward the horizon. We stood there watching them. There was something deeply peaceful about that moment. No rush, no distractions, just father and son standing together outside, sharing a few quiet minutes. At the time, it didn't seem important. Now it's one of the memories I treasure most. Eventually, we went back inside. Dinner was ready. Everyone gathered around the table. We sat down together, preparing to enjoy the meal we'd planned only the night before. It should have been an ordinary family dinner. Instead, everything changed almost immediately. We had barely settled into our seats when my dad suddenly suffered a massive heart attack. One moment he was sitting there with us. The next, everything became confusion. The peaceful evening disappeared in an instant. What followed happened so quickly that parts of it remain a blur even now. People reacted. Voices filled the room. The quiet atmosphere that had surrounded us only moments before was gone. Despite everything that was done, there was nothing anyone could do to stop what was happening. My dad died right there at our dinner table. The man I had felt such an overwhelming need to see only 24 hours earlier was suddenly gone. The shock of losing him was impossible to put into words. One day, he was busy living his life. The next, he was gone. For a long time afterward, I kept thinking back to the night before, to that overwhelming feeling that had appeared without warning, to the urgency that refused to leave me alone. I questioned it over and over. Why had it happened? Why that night? Why had the need to see him been so powerful that I couldn't ignore it? I've searched for ordinary explanations. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe my mind somehow noticed something I wasn't consciously aware of. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable answer that I'll simply never understand. But none of those explanations completely satisfies me. I've lived my entire life without ever experiencing anything remotely similar. Before that night, I'd never felt such an overwhelming certainty that I needed to be with someone. Since that night, I've never felt it again. It happened once. Only once. And it led me directly to my father during the final evening of his life. I still think about those quiet moments outside together. The fresh air, the peaceful silence, the geese passing overhead. If I hadn't made that phone call, that moment never would have happened. We never would have stood together beneath the evening sky. We never would have shared those last few peaceful minutes before everything changed. As painful as that night was, I'm grateful beyond words that I listened to whatever that feeling was. Had I ignored it, I would have missed seeing him entirely. That thought has stayed with me ever since. Losing him was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my life. Watching someone you love disappear so suddenly leaves a space that never completely fills again. Even now, thinking about that evening brings back both sorrow and gratitude at the same time. The grief is still there. So are the memories. But so is the quiet comfort that comes from knowing we spent those final hours together. I don't know what caused that overwhelming message I felt. I can't explain it. I don't know whether it was instinct, coincidence, something beyond my understanding, or something I'll never have the words to describe. All I know is that it was louder and clearer than anything I've ever experienced. It demanded that I see my father. I listened. And because I did, I was there. I was there to spend one more evening with him. I was there to stand beside him under the open sky. I was there to watch the geese fly overhead together. I was there to share one last meal with him. And I was there when he took his final breath. As horrifying as that memory will always be, there's another side to it that has brought me peace through the years. For reasons I may never understand, something gave me the clearest message I've ever received. It arrived without warning, impossible to ignore, and disappeared forever once it had served its purpose. Whatever it was, it brought me to my father on the last day of his life. I still carry that mystery with me, and although I may never know why it happened, I find comfort in believing that I was meant to be there. Not to change what was going to happen, perhaps no one could have, but simply to make sure that, in his final moments, he wasn't alone. That thought has stayed with me ever since, and in the midst of one of the worst nights of my life, it remains the one thing that brings me a quiet sense of peace. When I was a teenager, my family lived in a house with a layout that made it easy to hear and see almost everything happening near the front entrance. The front door opened directly into the base of the staircase that led upstairs. If you stood at the top of the stairs and looked down, you had a clear view of the front door below. Upstairs, my brother's bedrooms and mine were located just off the landing. My mother's bedroom was farther down the hallway. It wasn't a large house, so noises tended to carry easily from one floor to the other. There was one thing about living there that always bothered me. My mother had a habit of forgetting to lock the front door. It drove me crazy. I was probably more paranoid than most teenagers, But before going to bed every night, I always made a point of checking that the door was locked. It became part of my routine. I'd walk downstairs, make sure the deadbolt was secure, check it one last time, and only then would I head upstairs to bed. It helped me feel safe. One night, something happened that I've never been able to explain. I was asleep in my bedroom when I suddenly woke up. At first, I didn't know what had disturbed me. Then I noticed the light. My room was brightly illuminated. Not continuously. The light flashed on and off. Each burst was strong enough to light up the room before disappearing again a moment later. For a few seconds, I lay there, trying to understand what I was seeing. The flashes weren't coming through my bedroom window. They were coming from somewhere out in the hallway. Between each burst, the room became dark again. Then another flash. Then darkness. Then another. As I listened more carefully, I realized there was another sound. A series of strange beeping noises. They weren't especially loud, but they were clear enough to hear between the flashes. I had no idea what they were. Still lying in bed, I reached over to check the time. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Seeing the time somehow made everything feel even stranger. The house should have been completely quiet. Instead, bright flashes were lighting up my room, while an unfamiliar beeping echoed through the hallway. I got out of bed. Slowly, I walked over to my bedroom door and opened it. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I realized the light wasn't coming from upstairs at all. It was coming from downstairs. Every few seconds, another brilliant flash lit up the staircase. Each burst reflected off the walls and climbed all the way to the second floor, bright enough to reach my bedroom. The beeping was easier to hear now as well. It seemed to be coming from the same direction. I couldn't identify it. It wasn't the sound of an alarm I recognized. It wasn't the microwave. It wasn't a smoke detector. It was just beeping. Steady, strange, completely unfamiliar. I stood there trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to go downstairs and investigate. Another part wanted absolutely nothing to do with whatever was causing those lights. Fear won. I stayed exactly where I was. I don't remember how long I stood there listening. It might have been a few minutes. It might have been longer. Eventually, the flashing stopped. The beeping stopped too. The silence that followed somehow felt even more unsettling. I waited a little longer before convincing myself to move. Very carefully, I approached the top of the stairs. There was a banister overlooking the front entrance below. I leaned forward just enough to peek over it. From where I stood, I could finally see the front door. Immediately, something looked wrong. The blinds covering the narrow window in the front door had been moved completely to one side. Not partially open. Not crooked. They were hooked all the way over, leaving the window completely uncovered. I had never seen them positioned like that before. The opening allowed someone outside to look directly into the house. It struck me as incredibly odd. I stared for several seconds, expecting to see someone standing outside the glass. There wasn't anyone there. At least, not that I could see. The downstairs appeared completely empty. Nothing moved. No more flashing lights appeared. The beeping never returned. Even so, I had no intention of going downstairs. Whatever confidence I normally had disappeared the moment I looked toward that front door. Instead, I quietly backed away from the banister. I returned to my bedroom. I closed the door. Then I climbed back into bed. Sleep wasn't even a possibility anymore. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. Every little sound made me pay attention. Every passing minute felt unusually long. I kept waiting for the lights or the beeping to start again. They never did. Morning eventually arrived. With daylight filling the house, everything felt much less threatening. I finally went downstairs. The first thing I checked was the front door. It wasn't locked. That immediately caught my attention because locking it before bed had become such an ingrained habit for me. I was almost obsessive about it. Every single night I checked it before going upstairs. Yet somehow, that morning, it was unlocked. That discovery unsettled me almost as much as the events during the night. I couldn't remember unlocking it. No one else in the house mentioned getting up during the night. There was no obvious explanation. I looked around for anything else unusual. Nothing stood out. The blinds were no longer hooked open the way I'd seen them during the night. Everything else appeared perfectly normal. There was no sign explaining the bright flashes, no device making strange beeping sounds, nothing to suggest why my room had been illuminated so intensely only hours earlier. For a long time afterward, I tried to come up with ordinary explanations. Maybe an emergency vehicle had parked outside. Perhaps flashing lights had reflected through the front door. Maybe some piece of equipment had produced the beeping. Those possibilities certainly crossed my mind, but none of them ever seemed to explain everything. The flashes were incredibly bright, bright enough to travel from the front entrance all the way up the staircase and light my bedroom. The blinds being hooked completely open seemed unusually specific. And then there was the unlocked front door. That detail bothered me the most, because checking that lock every night had been something I rarely forgot. Even now, years later, I still don't know what happened. I've heard plenty of possible explanations over the years. Some people suggest emergency vehicles. Others mention electrical problems or unusual reflections. A few have offered far stranger theories. When I was younger, my imagination certainly went in that direction. At the time, I honestly wondered whether it could have been something completely unexplainable. For a while, I even convinced myself it might have been aliens. Looking back now, I realize that was probably my frightened teenage mind trying to make sense of something that felt impossible. I don't actually know what caused the lights. I don't know what made those strange beeping sounds. And I don't know why the front door was unlocked the following morning. All I know is that I woke at 3 o'clock in the morning to brilliant flashes of light filling my room, mysterious beeping echoing from downstairs, and a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar. When the lights finally stopped, I looked over the upstairs banister to find the front door window completely exposed, as though someone had deliberately pulled the blinds aside. I spent the rest of the night awake, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing ever did. To this day, it remains one of the strangest nights of my life, and despite years of thinking about it, I've never found an explanation that completely fits everything I experienced. Thank you for letting these stories be part of your evening. I hope they brought you a little calm, a little mystery, and maybe even a little sleep. Take care, and I'll see you again very soon. Good night.